Thank you for joining us for another Macdonald-Laurier Institute webinar, The Ties That Bind, Forging a Closer Transatlantic Bond Between Canada and Germany in a Troubled World. And joining us today, three terrifically informed panelists. Dr. Anita Schwarzer is the director of the German Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Matthias Zimmer, who sits in the German Parliament, and Vice Admiral retired Mark Norman. But before that, a quick introduction to the Institute. For viewers in Canada, Europe, and elsewhere who are not familiar with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, the Institute now is in its 10th year. It is the top independent federal public policy think tank in Canada's capital. Macdonald-Laurier Institute's impact has been felt on issues as diverse as healthcare reform, access to justice, and prosperity and opportunity for Indigenous peoples. And particularly over the past few years, the Institute has had a growing impact on issues around global affairs, defense, and security. For example, nearly every day recently, you will see MLI's experts in media interviews, op-eds, and parliamentary committees commenting on Canada's tense relations with the authoritarian regime in China. This webinar is the final event in a four-part series on the post-COVID world order, created in partnership with Germany's Konrad Adenauer Foundation, one of the world's biggest and best-known policy institutions. And I'd especially like to thank our colleagues at the CAS for their support. I'm delighted to be moderating this webinar as a German-Canadian dual citizen, as someone who's lived in Canada and made Canada his home for over 30 years. But one of the key differences over that time has been that when I first moved to Canada, Germany might be sort of a peripheral mention in the news somewhere far down from the headlines and only occasionally. And I would say one of the main changes of the last 20 years is that Germany has become a prominent player, certainly in Canadian news, and may have become the most prominent nation state player in Europe insofar as Canadian news is concerned. And so I think this really illustrates in many ways the rise of Germany. And we sometimes say that Canada is a regional power without a region. We might say that Germany is a regional power that seems to know no boundaries in terms of the influence of when it is called upon and its interests that span far and wide. The relationship between Canada and Germany has sometimes been dubbed the Gold Dust Twins. It's sometimes also been referred to as a special relationship, as we shall return to in a few minutes. But first, I would like to invite for some opening remarks Her Excellency, the Ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany to Canada, Sabine Schwarzer.
I'm very happy to introduce this webinar by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, who's been promoting political debate so dynamically, particularly during the last 8 months. It's wonderful to have the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung here in Canada now, at a time where our countries are getting ready to recover from the pandemic, and at the same time we'll have to redefine their priorities and where they stand. Two recent events, I think, will shape the discussion today. And after this bleak year, 2020, thank God, these are two happy events. One is the election of Joe Biden to the US presidency. After a hugely disruptive 4 years, we will see an administration in office that respects the same values as we do, respects alliances, uses them as leverage, and is experienced in foreign affairs. The other good news is the beginning of the COVID-19 vaccinations in several countries. In Canada, too, the BioNTech-Pfizer vaccine has just been certified. And an aside, if everyone had needed an argument for transatlantic and indeed global cooperation, this vaccine is it. It was developed by German scientists of Turkish origin, produced by a US company led by a Greek origin CEO. Anyway, it's reasonable now to hope that the pandemic will be more or less under control by next summer. But it's by now also a truism to say that nothing will go back to the old normal. Over the last years, we, Canada, Germany, and Europe have seen that we cannot always rely on having a benevolent and generous US as our partner. We have seen that national egotism has found huge support in the American population, and it still continues to have it, as the election also showed. Our multilateral institutions, including NATO, as the strongest transatlantic link, have been stressed to a breaking point. We have painfully experienced our dependency, particularly on the United States and on China, when it came to medical goods and protective equipment. In the rising big power antagonism, middle powers like Canada and Germany had to fear to get caught between the big millstones. Now Canada really knows what it is like. We must draw a few lessons out of the last few years, and I will raise a quick 5 points that no doubt the panel will discuss further. First point. We, Germany, maybe also Canada, will have to take on greater responsibility and a fairer share of the burdens. For Germany and Europe, that certainly includes a stronger part in taking care of conflicts in our neighborhood. Second point, we need to engage decisively and fast with this new US administration, and I would suggest on the 3 C's: COVID, China, climate change. These are the biggest challenges we face. To both Canada and Germany, it's important, beware of just zeroing in on only the bilateral relationship with the United States. We have learned it the hard way. It is in our interest to diversify and to keep cooperation with like-minded partners high on our priority list. Be it in defense of multilateralism, be it in a NATO presence in the Baltic states, or be it in the Asia-Pacific space. The fourth point, let us intensify, let us even integrate where possible policies between Canada and the EU in those areas where we have an interest in becoming less dependent and or when it comes to future technologies. These are really low-hanging fruit, and Canada and Europe promise rich harvest for each other. Some key areas would be the digital realm, hydrogen, artificial intelligence, natural resources, and minerals. Last point, and the fifth point, there are no two countries that are closer in values than Canada and Germany. We both have high international standing. A recent Ipsos poll saw Canada and Germany way ahead as the two nations most people in the world would like to see take on a stronger global role. That's a big compliment, and I would say it's a call to action. I am eager to follow the discussion today, and your excellent panelists, thank you for having me.
I want to thank Frau Schwarzer for these insightful opening remarks. All 5 points are points that we are bound to return to over the course of our webinar today. I'd like to set the scene in terms of sort of 3 rough sort of parts maybe for our discussion this morning of how I have tried to kind of think about some of this relationship and why this relationship is so important. And picking up on Her Excellency Sabine Schwarzer's last point about how close we are in values, one of the things that Canada and Germany have in common is an unwavering commitment to the transatlantic architecture, to transatlantic security, and to their commitment in terms of working with Washington. And that, of course, sets Germany also somewhat apart within Europe, and in particular within the European Union, because the United Kingdom has a similar commitment to the transatlantic relationship. But of course, as we all know now, outside of the European Union, And France has always had, shall we say, a much more complex relationship, both in terms of the transatlantic architecture as well as the collective security architecture. And perhaps the principal pillar of that relationship is the unwavering commitment that Canada and Germany have to NATO as this very significant multilateral organization. And so working multilaterally, trying to work with other countries, binding them to one another, and relying in many ways on soft power or hard power elements in concert with other countries is part of the DNA that both countries share, and that I think is one of the reasons why the two countries are so important and so close to one another. And so I think this is sort of the part one of the conversation. The second part of the conversation is there's, I think, a lot of enthusiasm currently about sort of a rejuvenated transatlantic sort of effort to re-engage in terms of multilateralism and sort of a renaissance of the liberal international rules-based order. And I'm not quite as I guess euphoric as perhaps some other commentators on this. On the one hand, in Germany, there is a real, genuine debate about the future of Germany's relationship in international affairs. And so there is an important minority of Germans that are solidly behind their transatlantic relationship and rebuilding multilateralism through the transatlantic relationship. But there's also a significant portion of citizens in Germany that would like to see greater independence, and independence in particular in terms of a more integrated Europe, and a Europe that is less reliant on the United States. And there's also a third option of a lobby that would advocate greater neutrality for Germany, both in terms of the transatlantic relations and in its and the way it is situated within Europe. And I bring this up because for Canada, this raises some real, genuine risks because Canada has relied very heavily on the transatlantic relationship to reinforce and multiply its particular interests and its values, and to assert those internationally. And so options 2 and 3 here pose a significant risk to Canada. At the same time, of course, I think while we might see a re-engagement in terms of multilateralism, I'm less convinced that the Biden administration will double down on what has been called over the last 25 or so years the liberal international rules-based order. And perhaps the third part of our conversation can be where this relationship is headed, where it is headed in light of globalization and the challenges and opportunities that globalization has brought us over the last 25, 30 years, where it is headed in terms of the rise of China, and where it is headed in particular with regards to the pandemic and past post-COVID geopolitics. And of course, all of those involve China. But in that sense, we can also realize that the bilateral relationship between Canada and Germany is contingent on dynamics that are beyond both of those countries, and in particular dynamics within the European Union, dynamics with regards to the United States, and dynamics with regards to China. But first, let me turn it over for some opening remarks to our 3 terrific panelists who have taken time this morning to join us here for this webinar. And the first individual to intervene will be Dr. Matthias Zimmer, who's been a member of the German parliament since 2009. Dr. Zimmer holds his PhD from the Helmut Schmidt University of the German Bundeswehr, where I also have the opportunity to teach fairly regularly, including at the German Staff College. He has also at one point worked for the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, which is supporting this webinar. and spent 4 years in Canada from 1994 to 1998 in Edmonton, Alberta, at the University of Alberta teaching German studies. So someone who is quite familiar with Canada, and I suspect this is probably also part of the reason why he co-chairs the German-Canadian Parliamentary Friendship Group. Dr. Zimmer, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Christian, and thank you for having me here. I really sometimes feel like someone who woke up from a long nightmare, still trembling and not sure that those specters that haunted me in my dreams are gone for good. The outgoing administration in the United States has thoroughly destroyed the hitherto existing base of trust between Germany and the United States. I'm not sure about the Canadian experience, but I gather it may not have been a happy one as well. So what should we do in this new era? Just push the reset button? I don't think so. From the German perspectives, I like to give two answers, the second of them involving Canada. The first answer is obvious and significant reinforcement of Europe's ability to hold its own in a multipolar world. I'm not too realistic. I don't think it's too realistic. And I would leave that to that option to our debate. That leaves us with the second strategy, which I would call flexible multilateralism. Germany has many foreign policy interests that can pose problems for various players. Why should it not respond with changing alliances as to reinforce its own ideal of a rules-based order? Some alliances will presumably be forged with the United States, while others will be in opposition to the United States. There are many reasons to strengthen multilateralism. For this reason, on the fringe of the session of the United Nations General Assembly in 2019, 50 states came together on the initiative of France and Germany to form an alliance for multilateralism. Canada is part of that alliance, as are India and Australia. The alliance intends to begin by driving cooperation forward in the following 6 areas: climate and security, information and democracy, rules on the use of lethal autonomous weapon systems, gender equality, humanitarian cooperation, and a set of rules for the use of cyberspace. This agenda itself shows where potential conflicts might lie. To be sure, multilateralism is the refuge of all those states for which it is impossible or almost impossible to act unilaterally. Multilateralism is the power tool of the powerless. Yet since we live in a multipolar world, it seems fair to say that every country, each in its own way, relies on the inclusion of multilateral instruments and elements in its foreign policy. That even applies to the United States. It too sometimes needs partners and allies to pursue its interests. Besides, the price of cooperation is often lower than the cost of unilateral action. Statesmanship includes the ability to create linkages between different foreign policy areas in pursuit of mutual interest. Another element of flexible multilateralism could consist in strengthening existing international organizations. I'm thinking here primarily of the International Labour Organization, which possesses a high degree of international legitimacy because of its particular consensus-based decision-making procedure. The shaping and regulation of industrial relations is also a key building block in the consolidation of human rights. Lastly, there also seems to be a need to back up the advocates of rule-based systems wherever they are being questioned. When there are more and more indications that an international of the right exists, devoted to exporting the attitudes of the Tea Party, a liberal international in the spirit of Grotius and Kant is also a legitimate concept. History has shown that democracies can also perish because of internal indifference, and that wars can start because nations have made their own interests an absolute imperative. Those who forget these things are doomed to see history repeat itself. The dangers, however, do not come in the same old format, but in a new guise. Theodor W. Adorno once said that he did not fear fascists wearing fascist masks, but fascists wearing Democrat masks. I hope you will forgive me this little emotive digression, but as a member of Parliament for Frankfurt, I often insert a little commercial for the Frankfurt School. Angela Merkel, who has not studied in Frankfurt, frequently stresses that 21st century problems cannot be solved with 19th century instruments, nor, I might add, with a 19th century mentality. The world has become too small for self-seeking attitudes on the part of nation states. We are all interlinked in a globalized planet for better and worse. In the 19th century, Honoré de Balzac presented a famous thought experiment in the form of the Mandarin parable. What would you do, he wrote, if you had the possibility to become instantaneously rich under the sole condition that by simply willing, without anybody knowing, you would kill a mandarin in China? The idea of killing by remote control was unusual at that time because social relationships and relationships of belligerents were not conducted in a separate geographical spheres. Today, however, in this age of cross-border environmental pollution, international value chains, and unmanned lethal drones, this notion is highly plausible. Great power politics determined the structure of international relations in the 19th century, but human rights and flexible multilateralism are key elements of the international order in the 21st century. At least for Germany, it seems fundamental to me that foreign policy must draw its strength from historical experience and from commitment to a post-Westphalian order in which the sovereign state is no longer the measure of all things. And this is exactly where I hope to see Canada on our side. Thank you very much.
And you have already relayed, I think, one of the great challenges of the 21st century, that we work within sovereign state Westphalian structures to try to solve challenges of globalization and transnational movements and flows and trade and so forth. And so building these international institutions and structures for a 21st century is an opportunity, I think, that we hopefully can get back to during the discussion. Dr. Daniela Schwartz is the director of the German Council on Foreign Relations. She's previously been with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She also served for several years with the German Institute for International Security Affairs, the Stiftung Wissenschaft Politik in Berlin. She's also a keen observer of France and French politics, which I think inherently, when we talk about transatlantic relations, the United States and Germany, it is always difficult to, this is inherently one of the dialectics that will always be coming to the fore. She's a research professor at Johns Hopkins University, Bologna, the School of Advanced International Studies, and has also spent time at Harvard. Frau Dr. Schwarzer, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Christian, for your warm welcome and for making me part of this discussion today, which I think comes at a great moment in time. You know, sitting in Berlin, I can tell you, of course, that a lot of the political attention is really on what is now happening in the United States and how we should approach, not we only as Germans, but we also as Europeans, how we should approach the transatlantic relationship. And I think the most important thing here is to work with a broad definition of transatlantic relations. For Europe, this has implications, meaning we should not only think Germany or EU and the other side of the Atlantic, but we must include the United Kingdom in those reflections, although we are seeing day by day how difficult the separation or the future relationship with the UK actually is. And on the other side of the Atlantic, it is fantastic to now in this group to discuss Canadian relations with Germany, but this is also happening in a wider context of relationships across the Atlantic, on the other side having the US and Canada. Now, I think we share among Canadians and among Europeans, and in particular Germans, a nightmare, which Mr. Zimmer has pointed out that he woke up from it. 4 years of Donald Trump, basically a US president who has destroyed, or at least tried to destroy, what, from a German perspective, is really, the right prism to look at international relations through. For instance, the transatlantic relationship he undermined, the relationship with Germany, but also the whole notion of multilateralism. And the alliance of multilateralists was mentioned, which was really an attempt by the German government with France to offer an alternative, to offer a framework where like-minded countries could come together and deal with pressing political issues. And Mr. Zimmer has given us the list of priorities there. So I have observed closely how Canada engaged in this. There were several meetings on the ministerial level, and there you could see how Canada and Germany basically work very well together and have basically used this opportunity to define a common agenda and to work on those issues. But if we look ahead, I think we need to delve a little deeper now with that opportunity that we have with the new incoming leadership in the United States. And I think what we have both suffered from, Canada as much as Germany, is a loss of trust in the US, not only as a partner to our respective countries, but basically also as a reliable partner when we look at the world. And so the opportunity in the first half of the year 2021 is clearly to rebuild that trust at the heart of our alliance, including Canada and Germany, and to really look back at what has happened in the US, but also what is happening in Europe with regards to the resilience of liberal democracy. And here I'm at a very sensitive, sort of touching on a very sensitive issue, just a few days after the European Council meeting, so basically the summit of the heads of state and government of the 27 EU member states, managed to agree on a compromise to operationalize and put into practice our new budget and the so-called recovery mechanism, which was put together to support countries in the COVID-19 crisis, which comes along with a deep economic slump in Europe. And we had two countries questioning the rule of law conditionality in this, and they threatened to veto the whole mechanism. Now, I am mentioning this as an example to say that although, you know, we would think that we were very worried about the United States and what happened to US democracy over the past 4 years, and now we saw that democratic elections brought a president, or will bring a president back to office who cherishes the Constitution of the US, the democratic institutions, the functioning of liberal democracy. On the European side, we also have homework to do. And transatlantic partners, including Canada and Germany within the NATO framework, will have to decide how to deal with Turkey as an ally in our transatlantic defense alliance. So I think really that there is a huge agenda in front of us. Rebuilding the transatlantic alliance, but also rethinking how we can reach out to the world based on the principles and norms that we share. And we need a very practical joint strategy how to tackle the biggest challenges. Now, this is going to be my last point in the introductory statement. Again, a European perspective here, and a Berlin one in particular. China is a huge political challenge for us to tackle. This will be one of the big issues that the Biden administration will put onto the agenda, not only for Germany, but also for Europe as a whole. Europe has aligned its positions on how to deal with China over the past 1 or 2 years. There now is a joint, I would call it a strategic document endorsed by the 27 heads of state and government, which classifies China not only as a partner, but also as a competitor and a systemic challenge. And that is very important, that we have a very realistic view on what China is for us, acknowledge the interdependencies that we have with China, but at the same time draw a very clear line where the systemic competition should inform our policy towards China, so we protect our own norms and principles. And I think this is a topic which should range very, very high on the German-Canadian agenda as well. Thank you very much.
Those were terrific insights in bringing together a host of highly complex and vexing issues that bedevil both countries and bring both countries together. Let me turn to our third panelist this morning, Mark Norman, Vice Admiral retired from the Royal Canadian Navy with over 39 years of service. Norman started his naval service as a diesel mechanic in 1980, and he rose to the second highest rank in the Canadian Armed Forces, the Vice Chief of the Defense Staff, which is really not one job, but it's actually three separate jobs all combined into one. So he knows how to do heavy lifting. His military career has seen him serve domestically and internationally, command a warship, the Canadian Atlantic Fleet, and ultimately the Royal Canadian Navy. He has extensive experience in a variety of appointments, training and educating sailors, leading operations, strategic planning, and managing major procurement projects. Although his direct connection to Germany is somewhat limited, Norman has worked extensively with the German Navy during two operational deployments with the NATO standing naval force, including enforcing sanctions against former Yugoslavia in the mid-1990s. And that's always something nice about shipmen and folks in the Navy, that they have lots of exposure to many other navies by virtue of these multilateral operations where we all work together in our common interests. Since his retirement, Norman has applied his energy to a variety of pursuits and contributed to debates about security and defense issues in Canada, improving the lives of sailors and families, as well as losing his fair share of golf balls and learning how to safely crash his mountain bike. And that makes two of us. Admiral Norman.
Thank you very much, Kristen. It's an honor to be here with you and this distinguished panel. I am by admission not an expert in Canadian-German relations, and I'm humbled to be part of this discussion, but as the only Canadian on the panel, I hope to provide a useful perspective to the discussion. A retired military officer, clearly, I see many of these issues through an understandable defense and security lens. I will often, for reasons of simplicity, therefore, look at things as strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, or threats. As we look, therefore, at the future of the transatlantic relationship, and specifically potential opportunities for enhanced relationship between Canada and Germany, I think it's important, at least from a Canadian perspective, to look at how this has evolved and what has potentially changed in recent years to set the scene, as you've already done in laying out the context. As the, quote, other country in the Western Atlantic, unquote, as we often are seen, described, and often self-identify in many of our relations, Canada, I believe, has suffered a bit of a schizophrenic identity crisis over the years. A part of this has been a need to define ourselves as being different from the United States. And in other cases, it's also been to either reassure ourselves or to potentially separate ourselves from our two former colonial masters, being the United Kingdom and France. And I'm not looking at deep history. I think these attitudes have permeated our approach to international relations well through the latter part of the 20th century. Past opportunities for cooperation, and there have been a few good examples provided by my colleagues already, have been based on the underlying belief and in this notion of shared values and a shared view of what you introduced as the liberal international order and the rules-based system associated with it. And I think that's an important theme that we need to continue to examine as we go forward. But I will offer, not so much as a counter, but as a different perspective, that in my view, for the Canadian-German relationship to be relevant in 2020 and beyond, it needs to be more than a simple nostalgic link to shared successes or even shared history. of the transatlantic relationship itself, or perhaps initiatives that the two countries have worked on together. It must be anchored in practical interests going forward. So as I try to imagine the future of any enhanced Canadian-German relationship, I see it being heavily influenced by, in my assessment, three important considerations. The first consideration is the emerging global security trends and the challenges that we're seeing to the traditional Western rules-based system that's been mentioned already in the introductory remarks. The second issue is the shifting views, as I see it, of what is meant by security in the minds of the citizens of Western democracies in particular, and specifically in Canada and Germany. And the third issue is the enormity of the economic impacts of the global pandemic. So I look forward to the discussion, and that's how I'll be approaching our time together this morning. Thank you.
Thank you for these initial remarks. So let me sort of see where I think we're currently at and sort of taking stake. Canada, of course, has a long-standing investment in Europe, both through the colonial powers that you mentioned, the United Kingdom and France. France was instrumental in Canada becoming a member of the G7. And of course, Canada has a long-standing interest and investment in Germany, both in terms of the First and Second World Wars. In both cases, of course, Canada joined in the fight long before the United States did. So in terms of the transatlantic relations, something to keep in mind and to remember. And then, of course, Canada had a significant deployment to Germany during the Cold War. Canada continues to be heavily invested in stability, peace, prosperity, harmony in Europe with its current deployment to Latvia, where it partners, of course, with Germany as the only continental European country that took on a framework nation leadership in neighboring Lithuania. And so I think we can see the closeness of interests and of ties here emerging. But I think both countries have challenges domestically in terms of how we operationalize and how we work in this new order, because in many ways, both countries had conveniently hitched their wagon to the post-World War II sort of international order, the multilateral order that the United States built. And both countries were somewhat disrupted in 1990, although I guess they didn't realize it as much yet at the time, as that this order was about to change, and about to change rapidly for a host of reasons, but including the fact that already at the end of the Cold War, we had rumblings in the United States that this order was quite expensive. It was really complex to manage. And that the security, that allies were essentially secure, that extended deterrence and some American troops in Europe could essentially assure the territorial integrity and the security of the continent. And so I think we have already seen over the past 30 years the shift in expectation in the United States that European allies need to do more for themselves and need to do more in particular for their own interests. And by that, I mean, in particular, their southern flank, for instance, in the Mediterranean, but also perhaps more in terms of some deterrence measures. And so I think this then brings us to the debate that we have in both countries about how to move forward, because, of course, both countries have this very close security relationship with Washington. And in many ways, their own foreign policy has been shaped by that particular close relationship. And so as we find ourselves, I think what Daniela Matthias described as sort of the nightmare and the loss of trust, in some ways, we've already been able to see that coming over the last 30 years. There have been signals all along, including the election of Bush 43 in 2000, if we think back to his particular election campaign. So really what I'm trying to point out is that the phenomenon of Donald Trump is not so much an aberration as it is a trend that has been a long time coming. And reticence by the United States about its continued engagement and investment and the payoffs that was generating for the United States. And so in light of that, yes, I think we sense in Europe in general, and in Germany in particular, serious misgivings about the Trump administration. But what I'm trying to, in my way, sort of trying to caution against is sort of a return to the status quo ex post ante before Trump, and that I think and that in many ways shapes how we go forward. So if we think about the options for Germany here, yes, a renewal of the transatlantic relationship in which the CDU and the Chancellor and Canada is heavily invested for a number of reasons, because that's where their interests in many ways lie. But that also then comes with a division of labor that's going to require a much more serious commitment with regards to Russia, with regards to the southern flank, but it might also require significant sacrifices by Germany in particular, by Europe in general, with regards to the relationship to China. So it's not obvious that there's going to be this immediate sort of renewal of the transatlantic relationship, because I think the US will dictate the price of that renewal, and I think the price and the commitment will be heavy. At the same time, Germany has the option of, and there's a significant, I think, minority of Germans that, as I think Matthias in particular pointed out, the sense of European strategic autonomy, which the French, of course, has been advocating for many years. And so the operational, technological, political independence of the United States, that also gives Europe more latitude on a whole number of areas. So there's not these difficult trade-offs with the United States. But I'm also not sure that is really possible, because, for instance, in the military sphere, genuine European strategic autonomy would come at a very heavy financial cost. A financial cost that I think most Germans and most Europeans would be unwilling to bear, and where there's a considerable lobby against that type of financial cost, in particular in Germany, where you have a very strong peace lobby. However, the sort of greater strategic autonomy would afford Germany in particular, and Europe more generally, I guess, more latitude in terms of how it would engage with China, and also how it would engage with Russia. And the third is this concept of neutrality, that there is a significant element in Germany that thinks that perhaps, Germany should neither hitch his wagon to the European Union, nor too much sort of our strategic autonomy, nor too much to the transatlantic relationship here. And we see that also in Parliament. And I think the coming election in Germany in the fall, in Canada possibly sooner, will have a significant sort of impact in how we recalibrate this. So we've had the election in the United States, but we don't yet know exactly how this is going to shake out in both of our countries here. And of course, Germany has a significant China lobby. It has a very strong Russia lobby, somewhere between 1.5 and 3 million Russian speakers in Germany that are not, neither of these lobbies are particularly enthusiastic, it seems to me, about sort of a rebuilding the transatlantic relationship. And so one of the risks, of course, is that Germany is going to try to muddle through, and that Canada is going to try to muddle through. But I get a sense that in the current circumstances, muddling through is not really an option. And I think Daniela pointed out nicely that the European Union now has a coherent strategy, for instance, on China, something that this country is still missing. And it sort of hints at the difficulties of trying to get on the same page on some of the greatest challenges that we face. And so I was hoping that each of you might weigh in on how you see the domestic dynamics playing out, because of course we need to legitimate whatever relationship we build or rebuild for the future within those electoral dynamics within each of our own countries, and where you think our populations are with regards to the relationship with the United States, with regards to multilateralism, with regards to greater strategic autonomy, and the move forward. So maybe in the same order in which we had the initial remarks, Matthias Zimmer.
Well, first of all, let me emphasize that not everyone who speaks Russian is a Russian lobbyist. Angela Merkel, for example, is fluent in Russian, and she has never been known as being a Russian lobbyist. Let me make maybe two remarks or three remarks. The first remark being, most Germans see Canada and the United States as the continuation of Europe with other means. In other words, North America is seen as something of a European country, European heritage, and I guess that's a truism, because most migrants in the United States and Canada are of European origin, and there are still strong ties, in particular in Canada, with Germany and other European countries, as far as those communities are concerned. The second point, I would like not to focus exclusively on foreign policy affairs and on the military dimension. I'm rather surprised that no one has mentioned yet the fact that, for example, we have a free trade agreement between Canada and the European Union, which we don't have with the United States. It's not been ratified by all European states as yet, but we managed to negotiate a functioning trade agreement. And I guess that is a value in itself and should be considered as a surplus in our relations. And thirdly, as far as the military dimension is concerned, I would argue that most Germans would argue, as far as the 1.52% of the GDP goal in NATO is concerned, that Germans are paying for the refugee crisis that was caused to a large extent by a bungled American foreign policy. So as far as the military commitment is concerned, you're certainly right. There is something to be done on the German side. But yet on the other side, most Germans would argue that we do have different interests as far as the United States on the one side and Europe on the other side is concerned, and that paying for the refugees should be factored into the defense costs as far as NATO is concerned.
Daniela Schwarzer, did you want to weigh into the conversation?
Yes, I'd love to. Thank you. So the first thing I'd like to pick up from your remarks, Christian, is really the discussion on strategic autonomy and to what extent this may be challenging closer transatlantic ties. Now, the term strategic autonomy is actually quite old. It was first endorsed by the heads of state and government in the EU in 2013, and then it was put into the EU global strategy in 2016. President Macron, so the French president, has picked up the term and has been pushing for it, but it is not an entirely new concept. Now, the problem that we are seeing in the current European debate, in my view, underlying the debate on whether we should call it strategic autonomy, whether we should be speaking about European sovereignty, or whether we should just say we have to increase or enhance our capacity to act, is basically that across EU countries, we are not entirely clear to what extent we can actually rely on the United States. And that brings me to another point you made, where you said, well, are we maybe going back to the status quo ante? Will Germany, not invest and just rely on the United States? I see our domestic debate rather going into the opposite direction of having difficulties to really retrust the United States, because there's this concern that this might only be for 4 years. Joe Biden, who says, I'll be back, that he said at the Munich Security Conference, he said in his speech, which he gave when he was last there, I think 2 years ago, he said, we'll be back. And yes, the US are back in the transatlantic alliance, but no one can be sure for how long. So I think what we have to basically admit to Europeans is their worry that they should be able to take important decisions and implement them in the area of security and defense, but also in the area of technology. So take those decisions independently, but in full, openness and transparency within the transatlantic alliance, and not as a challenge or even an attempt to undermine the transatlantic alliance. And putting it that way, I think, is acceptable to many policymakers in the US. If we talk about our own strengthening our own capacity to actually serve the transatlantic alliance. So I think that's an important movement in the debate as I see it. It is happening. There are still conceptual disputes. Some want to definitely call it European sovereignty. Others think that term is really dangerous. For instance, if you go to Poland or the Baltic states, they think this could actually undermine the US commitment to Europe. But I think we should just move beyond that and look very practically what we can bring to the table. Now, the other point which you mentioned and asked us to comment on is public opinion. I think that's a key issue. And I started in my first intervention with the trust issue because that is something that is really puzzling me and has been puzzling me for quite a number of years now. The difficulties of political leaders who are, who support closer transatlantic ties to get this across to citizens. And the loss of trust is not recent. It is not, Donald Trump has destroyed more trust, but this goes back to the Iraq War. It goes also back to the cell phone tapping, so the spying on German cell phones, including of Angela Merkel. And the interesting thing at that point was the German public reacted very strongly, while the French public, and the French president's cell phone was equally tapped, didn't react very strongly. So what happened here? I think in Germany at that time, there was a strong illusion about, friendship, an emotional side to the relationship, while the French reaction was, well, allies, spy on each other. That's pretty normal. But the German narrative about transatlantic relations up to that point had been a different one. So I take this task to rebuild trust very seriously. And what is really striking is the gap between policymakers' perceptions of threats and necessary alliances and the broad public perception. For instance, if you look at opinion poll data on what Russia is to Germany and to what extent it is a threat, public opinion will see a far smaller security risk or threat than policymakers, for instance, and the Defense Ministry or in Parliament will. And that's an important task to bridge that perception gap, because otherwise you can't build the support for a stronger investment into defense, for instance.
So what I hear you saying is that what I present as sort of three ideal categories of renewed transatlantic relations, the strategic autonomy, optional neutrality, certainly that the renewed multilateralism along with strategic autonomy are not necessarily zero-sum, but that the challenge will be how to make sure that they're complementary and that we can harness synergies for both sides of the Atlantic and all the member states on both sides of the Atlantic. And that's perhaps, I think, the most challenging way forward, also on the 5 points that the ambassador mentioned in her opening remarks. How do we turn this into complementarity and synergies? Mark Norman.
Yeah, so I'm not going to comment on the relative merits or probabilities of any of those options, but I do find it a fascinating discussion. My sense is that irrespective of how things might unfold from a German perspective, we still are going to be faced with a number of the constants in the external environment. And the second part of your question was related to sort of a domestic view. So I'm going to tackle that first, and then if I'm quick enough, then I'll comment on the external environment of the question. So, Canada and Canadians, I think, share many of the concerns that have been expressed in the previous speakers with respect to what's going on internationally, what's going on domestically. And certainly our relationship with the United States, of course, is different, as the Canadians know, and it's defined by an almost, it's a geographic reality. And that creates a bit of a dichotomy, if you will, in terms of how we see the United States from a domestic perspective. Complete integration, certainly the last 4 years have been a challenge. Most Canadians would share the view in Berlin and elsewhere that it's good news with respect to what's going to happen at the end of January. But I personally am a little more guarded in my optimism. I think, as has already been stated, that I don't think we're going to see a significant change. We'll see a change in terms of the personality and the behavior of the White House and the administration, but I don't think we're going to see a fundamental shift necessarily in how the United States deals with its friends and allies. I think that there's an issue here as well that occupies a lot of Canadians, which is the integration, not just of the economies, the cultural integration of the two countries, and how on one hand we want to exert our independence on a regular basis so as not to be seen as American. And then on the other hand, we recognize that our livelihoods and our day-to-day lives, in fact, are completely integrated. And that tends to affect the way that policymakers look at the United States and how they can effectively implement policy. What's interesting, I think, in Canada in the last few months is we're starting to see a growing concern about China. And this is for a number of reasons, including the ongoing custody of two Canadian citizens, the coverage of that case and the related case in British Columbia with respect to a Chinese business leader. The reality here is that it doesn't matter what the motivation is. Canadians are becoming increasingly concerned about how China is behaving internationally. And I think that is an interesting data point as we look at potential opportunities going forward. I had mentioned in my introductory remarks this notion of personal security, and I think that resonates in a different way. And my sense, and this is purely speculation, is that this is growing in other democracies and in Germany, I would imagine, as well, whereby there is no longer, or it's reducing the sense of a military or defense view of security. And it's now Canadians are starting to look at security more broadly. And certainly this pandemic, I think, has been a wake-up call to the fact that security threats are not necessarily shaped as we would traditionally imagine them, and this is causing Canadians certainly to think differently about how they measure and want to invest in their own security going forward. I also see a shared view between Canada and Germany as it relates to a desire for more peaceful approaches to international problem solving. Both countries are certainly happy to use their militaries if it's necessary to do so, and we've seen that successfully and effectively applied in the last decade, in a couple of situations ongoing, as I've already been mentioned. But I think that there's an important shared view of some variation of a modified peacekeeping approach to problem solving that both countries, I think, are quite inclined to pursue. So those are my views from a domestic perspective. As it relates to the international environment, sadly, irrespective of what may be going on in terms of the evolution of the two countries we're discussing, the reality is that, first of all, if I could be so crass, the bad guys are continuing to behave as if business as usual, irrespective of what's going on around us. We're seeing Russia continuing to exert its nationalist tendencies, continued acts of aggression, both in Eastern Europe and certainly in our northern frontier. We're seeing, as was already mentioned, although it's not getting a lot of attention, in relative terms, the continued instability in the Middle East and North Africa. Turkey was mentioned already as a trouble spot that certainly affects Europe, but is not necessarily isolated to just its regional implications. And then, as I mentioned already, the issue of China can't be overstated. And I think that those are constants and shared constants as we look at how we could work on this in the months ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a nice segue, I think, we spent a good deal of time talking about the context of the European Union, the United States, but I think there's an opportunity here to shift certainly to shift the conversation to China, the constraints that China imposes. And that's, of course, where there's an important divergence in terms of the relationship, that Canada's exports to China, for instance, are much smaller and mainly sort of agricultural than Germany, in terms of particularly its many of its industries that make a significant portion of their bottom line now in China, and that will be loath to have the United States constrain German and European trade with China. They will also be apprehensive about the United States trying to impose constraints on the use of technology that might subsequently have deleterious implications for the trade relationship. And so, you know, one of the takeaways here is that I think there's three particular dimensions about the relationship with China that might be worthwhile to circle back to people on, to comment on. So one is, I think, the challenge that globalization has brought us, where the sense was with globalization is that everybody's going to become more prosperous, and as a result, everybody's going to become more happy. But of course, we know that that's not exactly how it worked out, that in many ways, the prosperity, at least in the perception of many folks in the United States, has not worked to the advantage of the United States, but it has worked to the advantage, in particular, of China, and that has subsequently provided the rope on which China is now trying to figuratively trying to hang the United States. And so that has provided it the assets that it is now deploying in terms of geostrategic and great power politics, and its rather transactional approach to dealing with other countries that is not grounded in international rules, but seems to be more grounded in whatever generates sort of the greatest sort of immediate payoff in terms of broader geostrategical objectives. And then a third, of course, is the pandemic, and not just, I think, the unease that maybe many countries developed with regards to the relationship with China in terms of its own information sharing practices and how it worked with the pandemic, but also, as you pointed out, that the nature of security is changing, and that what the pandemic hinted at is that 2 years ago, I think we would have not gotten a lot of uptake if we would have told people that biosecurity may be the greatest threat that the international economy and that our democratic societies are facing in the 21st century. And of course, it is a biosecurity challenge from China that has brought us a very different sort of environment that strategically we live in today. And so I was hoping that each of the panelists could, in closing, comment particularly on the relationship with China, and where it's particularly Canada and Germany might find some common ground and might be able to move forward in that relationship, but also where you see the German-Canadian, the gold dust partnership, the special relationship, where you might see that going in a post-COVID strategic environment, and both the liabilities for the bilateral relationship as well as the opportunities. Matthias Zimmer.
Well, thank you. Difficult questions. First of all, it seems to me that China has managed to increase its influence in our near abroad, even with the COVID-19 pandemic, offering help, offering vaccines, and more, and thus increasing its influence in Africa and in some Asian countries. Secondly, I'd like to tell one little story. I'm a member of the Human Rights Committee in the German Parliament, and we haven't been able, although we tried for a couple of years, to get access to travel to China. We were basically barred from China because one of our members is an advocate of free Tibet, and the Chinese did not allow those members who are openly pro-Tibet, parliamentarians, one would say, to travel to China. And I guess that is not only an outrageous behavior, but I guess it points to a very sensitive question, and that is the question of human rights. Human rights not only with regards to Tibet, but also with regards to the Uyghurs, with regards to small minorities which are being suppressed in China, with regards to practices that the Chinese government apparently supports as far as organs are concerned, human organs, trafficking with human organs, and so forth. So I guess we should strengthen our efforts to uphold human rights vis-a-vis China. And I guess the second aspect would be, which is also a limit to German or to European autonomy. Europe alone cannot contain Chinese influence. We need a transatlantic partnership and a strong commitment of Canada as well as the United States to contain Chinese influence in the next couple of years. And I guess that is one major aspect in the decision where the international global order heads in 5 or 10 years. I recently read a book by a Chinese philosopher who outlines the Chinese view of the world order, the Tangxia, the all under the heaven ideology, which sees China as the center of the world. And I guess that's not the international order that we would like to have in a multipolar order, in a free world with free societies that are ruled by law and governed by law. And with the respect for human rights.
Thank you. Daniela Schwarzer.
Thank you very much. First of all, I subscribe to literally everything that Matthias Zimmer has just said. I would like to highlight one point on Chinese influence. I think we should be very worried not only about Chinese influence in our near abroad, but also within the European Union. And I remember diplomats telling me when, I was asking why the EU didn't take this or that common stance on human rights issues related to China, in a rather sloppy way. One of them said, well, because China sits at the table, because some of the EU governments wouldn't actually condemn China on human rights issues. And that is, of course, that's what I meant. We also have to do our homework at home. I wasn't only talking about the state of liberal democracy in EU member states, but it's also our degree of political independence and our ability to push back influence from the outside. And Russia is a topic here, but China is the growing and more urgent one, I believe, for the next years to come. So here, I think cooperation between Canada and Germany can be very, very useful. And it could be useful if Canada reminded Germany more often that it should be more outspoken on those issues. You highlighted, Christian, the difference in terms of interdependence with China. And, we could also just take the dependency side. The German economic model relies very heavily on China. And in political terms, it's hence sometimes more difficult to be very outspoken. So here is, I think, a task for, the next German leadership after the elections to engage very closely with the United States, with Canada, with European partners on the question how, and we have to start before the German elections indeed, how we devise a strategy towards China that on the one hand recognizes our interests in working with China and having close economic ties with China, but on the other hand giving us the independence, the political independence and the leeway to be outspoken on the issues that matter to us. This brings me back to the very first point I made when I spoke about rebuilding trust, including trust in our own strength of our liberal democratic systems. I think this is key. If we reaffirm not only this commitment, but if we also make sure we enhance the resilience of our national democracies, this is really the base upon which Germany, Canada, and the other partners involved in the transatlantic relationship can and should operate. Final word on China, I think we need to acknowledge that across different policy areas, a more constructive cooperation is possible and is absolutely needed in some, and a more confrontational approach is needed in others. So the topics that lend itself to close cooperation are obviously fighting climate change. And I think here, with the commitment that China has made to become carbon neutral in 2060, of course, it has to deliver on this goal first, but it is an important step. And here, I think Canada and Germany, along with the other partners, can work with China, but without giving up on the other more critical points that Matthias Zimmer and I have just mentioned.
I think that's a helpful call for many Canadians in terms of a more nuanced relationship and policy and strategy with regards to China. And I think on that, the European Union and Germany are further ahead than this country is, both in policy and in public debate. So certainly I think there's something for us to be learned, and we need to remind ourselves of that relationship and where we each stand. Mark Norman.
Yeah, Christian, I think your last point is a very good one, and it goes right to the heart of how we deal with this challenge. Dr. Zimmer's point really resonated with me with respect to the essence that this is where China is succeeding. When you have countries that are internally struggling with how to deal with China because there are such varying degrees of dependence and reliance on China, this is part of the success of their overall strategy. It's not to say that it's menacing, but it is a reality that we have to come to grips with. And if countries like Germany, through the EU, of course, can who are far more economically dependent on what China's doing, if they can come up with positions that are well reasoned and balanced, as we've just heard, then it's frustrating, to be blunt, that we're not able to resolve our own sense of how we want to deal with these challenges. I don't have a silver bullet, and I'm not going to be so arrogant or naive to pretend that I could suggest how we deal with this. What I would say is that I think as we go forward, I think there are real opportunities in very practical and I would say almost tactical or operational examples of how Germany and Canada could work together. I don't think we're going to be able to push back China from where they are, where they're already established and where they're well rooted. I think we need to look at what are the remaining frontiers that China has yet to fully leverage or get themselves established in, and that perhaps we should look at those, whether they're frontiers in terms of the physical sense or in the non-physical sense, where perhaps we could establish a presence that would allow them, or at least would not allow them, that would prevent them from gaining any ground. I give you an example of pick a country in Africa and let's get in there and let's do the same kind of thing that we see them doing all over the world, but let's do it in a way which is both consistent with our own values, but provides in essence a bit of a foil or a block. This may sound very much like the kind of behavior we saw in the height of the Cold War, and if so, okay, but I think we need to change the way we deal with this, because I'm not convinced that the issues of values and principles really resonate with the Chinese. They take a far more pragmatic view of the world. And I think we're going to have to, in some respects, approach it the same way they are. Those are my thoughts.
So I think what I hear out of those last three sets of remarks in terms of the bilateral relationship and how we re-engage multilaterally and with regards to the rules-based international order is that trade has brought us a great degree of interdependence, and it seemed to be we had a fairly broad agreement and consensus on this trading relationship. But now we realize that this trading relationship interdependence comes at a cost to us. And so, how do we balance the trade relationship, where it's easier to achieve consensus, with the broader relationship around issues of security, regional stability, and international stability, where the conversation becomes much more challenging because we don't necessarily see eye to eye, in particular in terms of the relationship with countries such as China, but also perhaps on what that means for transatlantic security infrastructure. But where it becomes really challenging is the conversation about human rights. But we need to remind ourselves that, of course, the conversation about that these three conversations are, and I think that came through in those last remarks, these are not separate conversations, but from the perspective of Canada and from Germany, that these are complementary conversations, because it's not just about the morality of human rights. It is about reminding ourselves of the Atlantic Charter. It's about reminding ourselves of Article 2 in the NATO treaty, that we believe that a stable and prosperous world is also based on a certain set of values, and that the opportunity for that there's significant challenges associated with other countries that do not share in that particular set of values. And so how we balance the relationship about values, about security and stability, and about trade, I think will be likely the determining elements of the bilateral conversation between Canada and Germany when it comes to the transatlantic relationship and international affairs. And it harkens back to Her Excellency Sabine Spavas's comments at the outset about reminding us about recommitting to the transatlantic and multilateral relationship, engaging on priority issues such as China, COVID, and climate change, cooperation and the synergies among like-minded partners, and doubling down on that cooperation. And never has it been more important than now. The opportunity to integrate ourselves operationally more, and the free trade agreement that was mentioned between Canada and the European Union is an important component, of course, of that. And the values that we share and the particular worldview that we ultimately share about what it means to live in a free, democratic, prosperous, harmonious, and safe world and society. So I want to close on those remarks. I want to extend my gratitude to our three panelists, Dr. Matthias Zimmer, member of the German Bundestag, Dr. Daniela Schwarzer, the director of the German Council on Foreign Relations, and Vice Admiral retired Mark Norman, formerly of the Canadian Armed Forces. And I also want to thank the team that made it all possible, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and their support, and the team with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So in particular, David Watson, Brett Myers-Lane, Alison Kerrigan, and the managing director, Brian Lee Crawley.